Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Sherlock Conversations. My name is Don Smith, and I am your host. And today we have the privilege of having a wonderful filmmaker, a man by the name of James Douglas, who is right now producing a new movie associated with Sherlock Holmes, and it's actually based on a short story that Stephen King wrote called The Doctor's Case. And Mr. Douglas has gone to a heck of a lot of trouble to put together this movie, to raise funding for it. And right now there is an Indiegogo campaign going on to raise some post-production funding for this. And I will have the links all below. So everybody, I would like to encourage you to donate to this project, because when you hear James's story and you hear the whole how everything transpired and fell together, I think that would actually make a wonderful movie in and of itself. And James is one of those people that I think is just awesome and very inspirational and makes the world a better place because they're going out and they're going after their passion. James, if you pardon the brown nosing, I really genuinely think what you're doing is absolutely fantastic.
Oh, well, thank you, Don, so much. I really appreciate it.
And I have to ask, though, you're making a movie, and it just happens to be coming out with another project associated with Stephen King that's about to hit the big screen. This summer we had The Dark Tower, and now we have It popping up. I think your timing on this is pretty darn good.
I would have to say so as well, and but I will totally say that it was completely by accident. It's serendipity. In fact, that's been a nice buzzword for this entire production. When we started this adventure back, it was just last November in 2016, if you can believe it.
Oh, wow.
We didn't really have any of that and the new hype about Stephen King that's happening on our radar at all. I mean, he is the master of horror, so he's always around, and I'm a huge Stephen King fan, which is one of the reasons why we wanted to do this particular project. But it's been particularly serendipitous that his name is in the news quite a lot these days.
Gotcha. If I can be slightly silly about this, the phrase that I hear some of my friends say is, some people call it coincidence, but the real meaning of coincidence is God working undercover. So I think you've got somebody on your side in a higher... I think you've got a larger movie fan, if you catch my drift, up there in heaven looking forward and trying to get this all together to help you out.
Well, we could only hope to be so blessed.
That's awesome. So, well, if I may, since you've got some really big names associated with this project, and I don't want to beat too much around the bush, but the fact that you got William B. Davis, the cancer man or the cigarette smoking man from the X-Files, and Denise Crosby from Star Trek fame, and also the granddaughter, either the granddaughter or the great-granddaughter of Bing Crosby. So you've got a lot of, from Sherlock Holmes to Stephen King to the X-Files to Star Trek The Next Generation, and also the world of Bing Crosby, kind of coalescing in British Columbia, which is pretty much, I think they've called that the Hollywood of the North, if I remember correctly.
They do indeed. Vancouver is usually referred to as Hollywood North, although a little interesting historical tidbit, it was actually originally coined about Victoria, British Columbia in the 1930s.
Oh.
And Canada's very first soundstage was actually built there. A lot of Canadians don't even know that, but I had an opportunity to do some film history tours in Victoria when I lived there. Found out a lot of really interesting stuff.
Oh, wow, very nice. So, I know that one of the big stories associated with this, you know what, let's go back, and could you just very briefly tell us what the plot is, without giving too much away, of The Doctor's Case?
I will try to be brief. I'm not really known for my brevity,
Okay.
but in a nutshell, it's The Doctor's Case is a Sherlock Holmes pastiche that was written by Stephen King in the late 1980s, and the conceit of it is that Watson is now in his late 80s, early 90s, and he's writing about the one time that he can recall solving a murder case before Sherlock Holmes. And so he's writing about a case that took place 50 years earlier. And again, without giving too much away, the reason that it all unfolds the way that it does has to do with a previously unknown condition that Sherlock has, which is allergies to cats. So cats play a big part in the reason why Watson was able to spot a particular clue before Sherlock does.
Interesting. So why adapt this story? Because I would think that there'd be, yeah, because you mentioned earlier before the interview that you were a fan of the Jeremy Brett Granada series, and most of the books you read were either Sherlock or Stephen King when you were growing up. What was it about doing this? Was it just, what was it that attracted you to this story that you're like, man, I got to put this on the big screen?
Well, one of the reasons is that I live and work in a very small community in the central interior of British Columbia that is right next door to a place called Barkerville Historic Town and Park, which is where I work full-time. I'm the manager of visitor experiences here. And Barkerville is a restored 19th century gold rush town. And it's a full-size town. There's 147 buildings in Barkerville. 107 of them are original, anywhere between 1869 and about 1940. And there's lots of amazing interior places. And I've done some, thanks to Barkerville and some of my other professional experience, I've been involved in some film production in the past, usually in a small role, either doing some writing or perhaps doing some co-producing. But I've always wanted to write and direct something on my own. I have a lot of experience as a theater director in one of my earlier parts of my career, and I always wanted to translate that to film. And to be perfectly honest, Sherlock Holmes is something that has been very close to my heart since those Grenada TV days, but I wasn't really quite sure if going ahead and just trying to to adapt one of the existing stories was exactly what I needed to do at this time. And I've been a Sherlock or a Stephen King fan as well, but it was last April, so not this past April in 2017, but April of 2016. An old friend of mine, we managed to, again, serendipitously run into each other, and she said, well, and I was talking about The Doctor's Case because I had recently reread it from the Nightmares and Dreamscapes collection of Stephen King's, and thought, this would make a really interesting thing for me to try and put together. Like, obviously the exteriors in Barkerville, which is a wooden town in the middle of a forest, don't really work for London, but some of the interiors do. So maybe there's something that I could do to try and put this together. But then again, this is sort of my year-long fantasy, thinking about this story and how I might be able to shoot it in Barkerville, but I had no real reason to. Like, I didn't understand how it would go anywhere. I don't have the rights to the story. But then this friend of mine said, well, I think Stephen King has a program, and it's called Dollar Babies, in which you can make an application to adapt one of his currently unlicensed short stories, and they'll sell, and King, through his publishing company in Bangor, Maine, will sell you not the license but permission, legal permission to film, to make an adaptation of any particular story that you've pitched, if they like the proposal. So I investigated it a little bit back a year and a bit ago, and found out that this was true. It's actually a program that he's administered since 1977. This is the 40th anniversary, actually. And a number of films have been made. A few of those films actually were good enough that he has gone on to negotiate a better distribution deal. But the idea behind the Dollar Babies is you can raise money to make the film, you get the opportunity to make it, he'll watch it, which is one of the interesting caveats there. Oh, wow. And then even if nothing else sort of comes of it, you're still allowed to enter it into not-for-profit festivals, and show it for free at educational institutions like Barkerville, where I work, and other places. So I just thought this would be a really interesting idea, and I was then about a month later ran into my friend Michael Coleman, who is an actor and theater teacher in Vancouver. He's sort of most famously known as playing Happy the Dwarf on ABC's Once Upon a Time, which films just outside of Vancouver. So, and I approached him because I thought there were some certain elements that he displayed that I thought would make a really interesting younger Watson for the story, and he was very interested. It's sort of against type for him normally, so he was very interested in having the challenge of taking on a different kind of role than he's used to, but also just the iconic nature of Sherlock Holmes and Watson as characters. You know, for actors, that becomes quite an intriguing opportunity. Because, you know, even though there's been lots of film adaptations, it's really still a very small niche, so there's very few people that have played those iconic characters. So that was back in May of 2016 that we talked about it, and then said, yes, let's see if we can do something and maybe apply for this Dollar Babies program. And then, of course, got super busy, and nothing happened for almost 6 months. But then back in November of 2016, I was doing some filming with a friend of mine, one of my colleagues here in Barkerville, who is one of the actors. Barkerville, as I mentioned, is a gold rush town, and we're a living history museum. So there's about 24 people in period costume, much like Colonial Williamsburg, and they do deliver all sorts of educational programs. And this one fellow, J.P. Winslow, who I've known for more than a decade, I was doing a little bit of promotion filming with him, and I started to, as I was uploading the video to my computer on that day, I started to see him in a completely different light and thought, you know, he would make a really interesting Sherlock Holmes. Quite a different take on what we've seen, perhaps, but no less reverential and serious. It was just he's got an interesting sort of way about him, and I thought, you know, I've been thinking about this thing now for nearly a year, and I don't want it to be one of those situations where I thought about it and had a great time talking to my friends about it, but then didn't go ahead and actually try to do it. And for whatever reason, and maybe that is our fans up above, on that day, I went back to the Stephen King website and I applied for the Dollar Babies program, asking for permission to adapt the Dollars Case. And it said on the form, allow 4 to 6 weeks for a response. 3 days later, I got an email back from them with a contract attached saying you have permission. So send us the dollar, and once we've secured that, you have a year from this date to make the film. And so suddenly we were involved, and suddenly it became this incredible adventure that we leapt on midway through last November. And then, as serendipity again would have it, Facebook reminded me on the 24th of September the 24th of November, that it was Denise Crosby's birthday. And as I mentioned to you earlier,
right,
I knew Denise through, believe it or not, she came to the central interior of British Columbia and came to our gold rush town in Barkerville in 2013 to be part of a little mini sort of fan con that we put on here in Barkerville. Which then launched a much larger fan convention that we're a part of in Prince George. But so Denise had been kind enough to come out then and was a real hit with the people that came out and saw her. I got an opportunity to kind of talk to her and get to know her a little bit better. And then we saw each other again at another convention last spring. So when Facebook reminded me that it was her birthday, and it also happened to be the anniversary of my mom's birthday, I thought, here it is, serendipity once again, right? Well, I've got to reach out to her and say, look, this is what I'm doing. I don't even have a script, but I would be really interested to talk to you about maybe taking on a supporting role in this film. And to my absolute pleasure but shock, she got right back to me and said, well, is it possible for you maybe to come down to LA, which is where she lives, and let's chat about this. So my producing partner, Norm Coyne, and I went down to Los Angeles in December and had a fantastic lunch with Denise. We talked about a whole number of things, but we brought up the doctor's case again, and right there she agreed, just based on the conversation with us and the subject matter and everything else, that she would like to be a part of it. And so we wound up writing a character for her, and that was one of the things that I'm most excited to do, because in the original pastiche story that Stephen King wrote about Sherlock Holmes, the doctor's case, the idea is that it's Watson 50 years after the case in question,
right,
writing the way he does in all of the first person accounts. And so, but we wanted to unpack that And I thought, well, what if we actually had an actor playing the older Watson who's then telling the story to someone, and then we go into flashback and see the events that took place 50 years earlier. And then we'd still, and then it's kind of like a Princess Bride sort of situation where we can have this older Watson being the narrative voice that breaks into the story every once in a while, and then we have the epilogue with them.
Right.
And so it was specifically the person that the older Watson is talking to, who was an American military nurse volunteering during the Blitz in London. We thought that's the character that we would like Denise to play, because then we can really craft it for her and for play to her strengths, and then provide a great opportunity for her to work off of another very seasoned TV or film actor that we might be able to get to play the older Watson. And because those scenes are essentially a two-hander, we knew that it would be a bit easier to shoot that, given their busy schedules and whatnot. And then we could film the rest of it with the crew that we have that is, our friends and colleagues and professional people who are all working very hard. But it would be a little bit easier not to have to deal with the schedules of people who are busy working, in LA and whatnot.
Right. Can I completely go on a different rabbit trail, but it was something I wanted to ask you about that you mentioned very briefly. You were talking about how you talked about this project to a couple of other people before you sat down and said, well, maybe I should send a message to, or maybe I should, before I apply for the rights to be able to do this. Well, my question is this. Speaking as a creator, have you ever been of the case where if you get really excited about a project, you'll share it maybe with a couple of people, but do you also try and not talk about it? Because the more you talk about it, the more it takes some of the, I don't know what you want to call it, it takes the urgency away. So that like for example, like if I said, hey, I've got this idea for a guy, okay? He's this super fellow who was rocketed to Earth from a doomed planet that explodes, but he lands in the middle of Kansas and he discovers that the Earth's sun gives him strength, and then he can fly and he becomes a reporter. And then you just kind of go, yeah, that would make a great idea for a story. Well, on to other things. And then that story never gets made. Obviously, I'm talking about Superman. But I was wondering, can you talk a little bit about that, or like going through the creative process like that?
I can, and you've hit it right on the nose. And I think that was ultimately, in this case, what propelled me to do that application on a day that I wasn't expecting to do it. Because there are several projects that I have floating around in the back of my head that I have talked about for years, and I think that it's exactly that, and funnily enough, Stephen King On Writing talks about that, the book that he wrote about the creative process. He sort of advises people not to talk about it too much, but to actually just sit down and write whatever it is that you're thinking about. Because precisely what you said, Don, the more you let the cat out of the bag, the less sense of urgency there is. You're already telling the story, and that thing that is inside of us that makes us feel the need to tell this story is being sated. So we may not get the final actual creative product that we were looking for, but some part of us is getting that hit. And so in this particular case, I think the reason that it is working better than any of the other ones that I have thought about and talked about is because I didn't do that. I only did talk to a couple of people about it because I didn't quite know how I was going to make it work anyway, and I didn't want it to be one of those things where I just talked about it for years and didn't get things done. And so once I had brought it up with JP, who ultimately played Sherlock, I realized, okay, I've now talked to the fellow who's going to play Watson. I've now talked to the fellow who's going to play Sherlock. If I just keep talking to people about this, it's never going to get done. Yeah. Now I have to sit down and actually put my money where my mouth is, quite literally in this case, and get this thing done. And it is precisely why we're now a week and a half away from having a finished product.
I got to ask though, how does that feel to see that though? Like there was a time in your life before you made a Stephen King / Sherlock movie. Now there's a time in your life where you've made a Stephen King / Sherlock Holmes movie.
It feels fantastic, to be honest. I mean, it has been very stressful. You know, our first day of shooting was just in the later days of March of this year. So to think about sort of where we've come from that first day of stepping on set to where we are now, it has been a lifetime in many ways. And I do, like, I'm still the same person. I'm still as jazzed by all of the things that I am, but I'm a little bit wiser about certain things. And I now know that the next film that I make is going to benefit tremendously from this particular project. But I'll tell you, you're absolutely right again. Like, it's a Stephen King project. More importantly, it's a Sherlock Holmes story. And that to me is so incredibly magical to be able to do for my first time directing a film.
You're coming to the end of this project. Are you at all allowing yourself to think about future projects now, or are you just basically saying, no, I want to get this finished, I want to ship this to the Stephen King people, I want to ship this to the film festivals, and then I'll worry about the next thing afterwards? Or are you just kind of like, you know, I do have this idea for something else that I'm already, that like, like right before you climb into bed, you just have a notebook and you're like, you know what we need to do? We need to find an Agatha Christie book written by Dean Koontz, something like that, or like a Miss Marple story written by Dean Koontz, or are you just kind of like going in a whole other direction or something?
It's a little bit of both. I am still very much in the doctor's case game right now, and especially now at the stage we're at with post-production. I'm living and breathing this film, and I'm watching it every day and getting new pieces of music from our composers, and so I really am. However, I would be lying if I didn't say there are 2 or 3 other projects that are sort of in the back of my mind that are waiting to come out and that have been talked about a tiny bit. But again, what is different about this is now that we are almost completed the post-production on the doctor's case, the only thing that has really changed is more people in the film industry are paying attention to what we're doing and are just having the time to talk to us. So throughout the course of this, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that it is a Stephen King product, and because it's Sherlock Holmes, those are 2 great words to be able to put in the same sentence when you're talking to somebody about film. So what ends up happening is that we do get people who are asking us, okay, well, what is next on your radar? And so we want to be able to have answers for that. And so I have some things that I would very much like to do, but I'm not going to really start any of those things until we've sent off that Blu-ray DVD to Stephen King.
Right.
Once that is away, that is for me, I think, although there's still going to be lots of Doctor's Case stuff because we'll be putting it into festivals and a whole bunch of other things. But I don't want to lessen this last leg of the experience that I'm having by starting to think about too many other things. I'm very pleased with the launch pad this particular film is giving me to talk about those other projects and see about getting them started. But I definitely want to see this one through to the end or at least to the penultimate end, before I look too seriously at something else. Right.
Now let me ask this. One of the things that's great about Sherlock is you could always write your own original Sherlock story. And go out, and now you've already got the apparatus in place. If you wanted to film it, you probably could.
You're very right. And in fact, some of the conversations have actually been about looking at adapting some of the existing stories again, because now that we've got a little bit of a taste for it in a pastiche sort of way, those of us who are Sherlock fans are really wanting to take a crack at some of the original stories too. But that being said, I have actually been approached by a couple of people who have written stories of their own that they would like to see adapted. And these are people who are steeped in Sherlock lore way more than I am, like people who really know what they're talking about when they're crafting these stories. And so I think that might be the next jump that I go to, because believe me when I say doing more Sherlock is something that we would really like to do. We would love to be able to keep our hand and our lives in this world. And because Victoriana is something that we do happen to know a little bit about, I think that's part of the reason. But I would love to do more Sherlock stories. And some of the people that I have been talking to who have written stories of their own, I'm really looking forward to seeing if some of those could bear adaptation into a film, and we might go in that direction as well. But I'm not a purist, but I am a sentimentalist in many ways, and I really like the idea of cracking open that old unabridged collection of Conan Doyle stories that I've had since high school, and seeing if there's something in there that I might be able to adapt.
Right, exactly. Let me ask this though, going back to Sherlock and everything, and I like to ask this of a lot of my guests. What does this say about us as a civilization, as an entertainment industry, as a pop culture, that we constantly are adapting Sherlock Holmes stories? Did you give any thought to this as to what this says about us? Like, what is it about Sherlock that you're drawn to? Why not try and go for something like why not go for like any billions of other characters that are out there, or create your own type of character? What is it about Sherlock that keeps drawing you back to him, and I guess keeps drawing us back to him?
Well, I think in many ways it comes down to that sort of archetype that is floating around inside of us in so many ways, because of, again, sort of with the proliferation of publication in the Victorian era, and the way things, the way that the sort of the rise of the novelist and short story writer, although people had been writing for centuries, I mean, it was really something that was becoming an incredibly popular thing. To look at a character like Sherlock Holmes, in many ways, he's kind of like the prototypical superhero, right? Like, here's a man who is very much from the outside a product of that very British society that he lived in at the prior to the turn of the 20th century, and then a little bit beyond. But he's also an outsider, right? He looks the part. He's from a good family. His brother does something with the government. We're not quite sure what it is. You know what I mean? Like, he doesn't really want for anything, but he wants so much more out of life. He has expectations, and he has this superhuman ability to sort of look at a situation and pick it apart and find the answers. And despite the rather acerbic nature of his personality at certain points, there is also a level of truth, honesty, and I would say love underneath him. I mean, certainly some more of the modern explorations of Sherlock have sort of played on that a little bit more than the stories themselves do. But I think that it's there, that through line of sort of truth and justice. He's willing to bend the rules for sure. He doesn't play by the rules necessarily, but he has a power, and like the Spider-Man thing, with great power comes great responsibility.
Right.
He seems to put that level of responsibility on himself. And I think that there is something about that character for me that I really admire, and kind of, there's a part of me that wishes I could be like that. I'm way more emotional than he is, and I'm ruled by my emotions way more than my intellect. But I like to think that I have an intellect, and I can understand sort of where that world is that he lives in. So I think that, even more than Superman, I would think that Sherlock Holmes is kind of a hero to me, that I didn't realize until I encountered the Jeremy Brett Grenada series, because I hadn't really, I was 13 years old when I saw that for the first time, right? Up until then, Sherlock Holmes had not really been on my radar other than like The Great Mouse Detective, and I think I'd seen Young Sherlock by that point or something. But it was the performance of that man in that role, and I was an aspiring actor even then, and I just thought, wow, here is something that I can really get behind. So I do think that's part of the reason why Sherlock keeps coming up in popular culture, because it is just part of that foundation of so many of the romantic superhero stories that we have then, and or westerns or whatnot, that we have in a North American culture. Because I live in British Columbia, and British is the first word in that.
Yes.
I think that that's part of the reason why that the sort of stories from across the pond has always been a part of our lives here. Like Canada is still technically part of Great Britain insofar as we're a Commonwealth country and we're a constitutional monarchy. I mean, it doesn't really play out that way in our day-to-day lives, but there is still a connection to England. So I think that made that move a little bit easier for me to be interested in those kind of stories. But it is also just that. I mean, I think I would think that a lot of us would like to have those kind of mind powers that Sherlock has, especially when it's described so succinctly. You know, I mean, in a way, it's better than having a superpower like Superman, because if we just tried hard enough, we probably could be like Sherlock, whereas we couldn't necessarily be like Clark Kent.
I like that. If we just tried hard enough, we could be like Sherlock. I like that. I like that a lot. Well, one of these days I'm going to write a book, and that's going to, not that I'm going to talk about it at this moment, but one of these days I'm going to write a book, and I will probably use that quote in there. That's pretty brilliant. James, where can people find out about the movie? And I'm assuming that you would have the links to the Indiegogo campaign there. We'll have a direct link on the website or in the Facebook page and on the Yahoo, or sorry, not the YouTube, when we put this up on YouTube and other places. Where can people, at least that are listening, where can they at least hear you or find out about the movie?
Yes, the sort of the most central repository for information is our website, which is www.thedoctorsmovie.com. No apostrophe in doctors, thedoctorsmovie.com. And we are also on Facebook at The Doctor's Case-Movie.
Thank you. James, thank you so much for being a part of the show tonight, and thank you for just taking time out of your really busy schedule to chat about it.
Oh, Don, I'm so happy to have been able to talk to you, and I hope that once we have it all finished and potentially released, maybe we could talk again.
Oh, absolutely. You always have an open door here. It'd be one of those things. I come in, walk into my living room, and I find you sitting there. I'd be like, "Oh, hi, James. What do you want to talk about? Let's go put this up." So consider yourself, you've made a friend here with the Sherlock Conversations.
Well, thank you very much, Don. I really appreciate that. And the same goes on this side of the pond, too.
Thank you very much. So, everybody, thank you so much for listening. Please go out there and support his movie. Depending on at what point in time you were listening to this, if you're listening to this soon, please support the Indiegogo campaign. If you're listening to this later on, please go out and watch the movie. I'm sure it'll be a blast. And also, thank you, everybody, so much for joining us today. And as always, have a great day.